In this episode of the podcast, we're going to be digging into the details of sustainable resource management. For this, we can't only look to the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources, but also need to involve another UNECE framework, the United Nations Resource Management System, or UNRMS. At its core, UNRMS provides a necessary and complementary system to UNFC for supporting the alignment of the whole raw materials value chain to the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals.
To give us some more detail on sustainable resource management, it is our pleasure to have Dr Eva Marquis of the Camborne School of Mines today with us. Her research has put the application of UNRMS centre stage in the southwest of England, where she's part of the Critical Minerals Centre team, a follow-on from the prior METFOTEC project. Eva is also part of the UK International Centre of Excellence in Sustainable Resource Management for the Circular Economy, or UK ICE SRM CE. Welcome, Eva, to the podcast.
So I'm Eva. I'm a innovation fellow and lecturer down here in the southwest of England. Just a bit of background. I'm a geologist by background. I started off by looking at how critical minerals are enriched in natural systems. But a couple of years ago, well, a bit more than a couple of years ago now, segued into looking at circular economy and mining. And that was part of a project called METFOTEC. So first acronym we got there, the Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Centre for Technology Metals, which was part of a big UK funded programme on circular economy research in the UK. And while we were doing that, we were looking at how circular economy can be embedded in the mining sector. And my collaborator, Francis Wall, came across a system called the United Nations Resource Management System. And that's sort of where we started with becoming engaged with the UNECE and all of their work. From this, we decided, okay, let's have a go. Let's try and apply it. We worked with some local stakeholders in the region, like the local enterprise partnership that they were at the time, the council, and the various companies working down here to really just have a go as to what is this system, what can it do, how can we apply it, and that's what we tried. And we tried it. We've got a case study out of it. We decided we would develop another centre, as you do in academia, another project, basically using it as a framework to inform what do we want when we're talking about accelerating the green economy in the UK in the context of critical minerals. What are the kind of things that you need to include, and how do you really get that transdisciplinary knowledge sharing? Sorry, lights in the office. How do you really get that transdisciplinary knowledge sharing working effectively so that you can tackle all of these really kind of complicated and overlapping challenges when it comes to actually figuring out how are we going to get enough materials to meet the energy transition demands, working towards a green economy, and how we do this in a responsible and sustainable way. So yeah, that's potted history of how we ended up here.
I think it's quite the background. Anybody listening is going to understand well and truly why we wanted to make sure that we got all of your brilliant perspectives on the podcast with so much experience in this. UNRMS came up in that as one of the acronyms. It's kind of a tool. Would you mind giving us a little bit of an overview about what the UNRMS is and maybe kind of how it sits alongside UNFC?
Yeah, sure. So the UNRMS was developed after the UNFC. So the UNFC came first, really as like trying to figure out how can you classify projects in a similar way for different resource types. Whereas the UNRMS was developed more as kind of the wraparound, the planning and what you want to do in the future. So what it is, it's a principles-based system. So there are 12 principles, but within that there are those 54 underlying requirements. The last time I checked, there are sometimes updates and things here. And really what it's trying to do is look at a regional system or a collection of projects, and this can be done from multiple perspectives. And you're starting by considering, okay, what is that entity's responsibilities, rights and responsibilities in managing those resources? And then that feeds down into something to kind of the fundamental principles of it around environmental social governance and economics. But when we're talking about economics, that's really the circular economy, bringing in that longer term circularity thinking into resources and resource usage. And then underneath that, there are then some principles around sort of competency, capability, innovation. Like, how do you actually facilitate the implementation of all those things you do to have a sustainable resource management system? So it's principles based. At the moment, it doesn't have any sort of standards associated. You don't have to do it, but it's kind of a useful framing for what you would want to consider potentially when you're talking about sustainable management of multiple resources, be that across a nation, a region, between projects. So a very flexible tool in this way.
Awesome. So I guess, is it right to say that if UNFC is the scoreboard in the classification system, UNRMS is the principles of how you can improve on that scoreboard and the how to do things in that responsible way?
Yeah, I would say that's what it's trying to do. Challenge being that they're working at slightly different scales. You could apply the UNRMS to a project and really look at that, see how it could improve your e-axis, for example, on a specific project. But really, some of its power and its strength lies in the fact that it is kind of this, it's referred to as the Swiss Army knife for sustainable development, like can really look across a multitude of lenses, a multitude of resource types, and begin to pull in all of those different views and information that's necessary to make choices across systems. So it's going beyond the parts of the system and trying to look at the system as a whole. They're complementary to each other. You need the data from the UNFC to inform how you're going to implement the UNRMS, but the UNRMS then supports you in your decision making for your UNFC projects. So they should be working in tandem.
And a nice chicken or egg scenario.
Yeah, very, very good one. Yes.
Thanks for that. So you mentioned the E-axis, which is one of the three axes of UNFC, E, F, and G. E-axis being the environmental, social, economic axis. Can you sort of expand a bit upon that, and like what do you think? Where do you think it sort of actually sits in UNFC, and is UNRMS really the key to sort of unlocking it actually being effective or being sort of measurable?
So I think the e-axis in the UNFC is still a bit of a challenge, but that's from a bit of a legacy of how the UNFC has developed, but also how our knowledge and understanding as a global society around what we actually need to know about environment, economics, people, in the sense of resourcing project has actually come on dramatically in a relatively short amount of time, and quite a lot of the mapping across to various codes, be it from the oil and gas sector, be it from Crisco, for mineral resources, a lot of that has actually predated quite a lot of the recent standards and pushes to really understand what do we need to know from a socioeconomic, from an environmental, from a social justice perspective in obtaining metals from mineral deposits. So with that in mind, the A-axis has to condense a huge amount of information from a variety of different sources, and putting it onto one axis just oversimplifies ever so slightly. So you could almost have 3 UNFC diagrams for any one project, and depending on whether you're looking at, I don't know, the people versus the environment versus the economics, you could come out in completely different areas on that axis based on the project. And it's trying to pull it all into one. And currently, with the current way that things map across, information gets lost in that process, in my opinion. So I think that it's something that is being worked on. It's quite tricky, but it's something that needs to be kept in mind when we're looking at projects that are classified to UNFC at the moment.
I think you raised such an important point of UNFC. There's always been this excitement around it, particularly from kind of where I sit within the industry as a sustainability consultant, that this is a way it's embedded. You can't get rid of it. It's part of the natural scoring. It's not a modifying factor you might have in Crisco. It's part of the core foundational work. And as you see, it's made up of so many pieces. So you've got the climate changey pieces, the social pieces, environmental, all of these elements that need to be integrated. Doing that on one axis is so complicated, and often you see it as its own three-dimensional cube. And you kind of touched on the way it's being done right now might it predate it and also have some challenges in synthesizing that. Would you be able to give us a bit of an overview as to what is currently being done? And then I'd be really interested to kind of unpick some of those challenges and see, how does UNRMS unlock the door maybe a little bit, or some other pieces?
Yeah. Well, I think we've seen in recent years, so if we go to mineral resources and we go to Crisco style codes, so with those, there have been so many updates in the past few years, or attempted updates to JORC, SAM codes, PERC, PARC. Pick whichever acronym for resource estimation system you so wish, and when it comes to reporting on them. But at the same time, like there is that bridging document that bridges one to the other. And previously, there was very, very limited environmental, social aspects that went into that. That is changing. I'm not saying that it's not changing. It is changing. So hopefully you would get more information for that e-axis. I think the key point, though, is that the UNFC and Crisco are coming from very different start points. Crisco is coming at investor confidence on stock exchanges. That is its main leaning. It's making sure that the information is there, that people can understand it when they're making investment decisions. UNFC is really coming from, how do we have sustainable use of resources that works well for communities, societies, countries, regions. They sound like they should be doing a similar thing, but in practice that they're coming from different lenses. So I think that always has to be considered, because something that might work in the Crisco space might not be good enough for UNFC, and vice versa. Something that UNFC does might not be good enough for Crisco. So there's this gulf in between, and you just going from one to the other. Sounds really simple. Yes, there are the bridging documents, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done to try and, work through that path between where those two systems are coming from, and the purpose for them. The purpose of the UNFC is for comparing multiple projects of different resource types. It's not about making a decision on one project. It's about, how do you get all of those building blocks of a resource system so you have an effective industrial ecosystem, or a sustainable production system that contributes to sustainable development. It's not about a single investment decision on one project.
Yeah, and I think there's so many great points in there. So firstly, that one-to-one mapping, but on one hand, it was seen as this perhaps great opportunity with UNFC to overcome, being really honest, some of the criticism of those other resource codes, in terms of not just the amount of integration and sustainability into them, but the how modern that approach to sustainability is. So there's that opportunity to revise it, but you've got a one-to-one mapping, which means that you're just potentially becoming dependent on something, and making sure that door of opportunity to refresh doesn't close. But then there's that metric point of, if they're aimed at doing different things, you need a different data set. So if we're too dependent on that mapping, we're using the wrong transformational metrics completely. I so agree with you. In a seed of hope from that. No, and we both know there is. Are there any good places that you can think of, or bits of research going on at the moment around the world, that maybe it's worth signposting people to, about some of that work that's going on with the e-axis or sustainability integration into that, that you're aware of? Has any of that come up at any of the conferences you've been to recently?
So I think that there are some great initiatives out there. So, the UNECE itself has its centres that are looking at implementation of UNFC, and they've got a really strong working group that is dedicated to the e-axis. So hopefully more stuff will be coming out of there. But I think the UNFC outside of certain circles is still really unknown. So some of the really good research that's coming out in that sustainability, environmental, social governance space doesn't necessarily know about the UNFC yet. So hasn't quite got into matching across. I would say there are some great resources available on the UNECE's website to go and have a look at this. But again, I think a bit more of a PR boost is needed for the UNFC to get people kind of thinking about it, for like, okay, what do we want on that e-axis? How do we bring that in? And the people who do codes from Crisco also should be involved in that, because there is some great work going on in that space as well. But it's just, how on earth do you tie it all together with so many different stakeholders involved?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of movement going on in the space.
Where can you sort of see it going into the future? Now we're talking about it sort of for carbon capture, for secondary resource raw materials. Do you think where will it move next? Will it move beyond just the sort of traditional raw materials thing? How is it going to classify some of the sort of more interesting deposits, let's say lithium brines and that sort of thing?
Yeah. Great question. It's hard to really pinpoint where it might be moving next, because it's already trying to do so much. There's work being done in the geothermal space. There's work being done on the recycling space. There's, as you said, carbon capture storage. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on. I would say, kind of from the European Union's Critical Materials Act, there is a push for that UNFC to also be applied to kind of midstream capabilities like refining and various parts of that system going forward for critical materials production projects, part of that value chain. So yes, there's an awful number of places where it could be applied. I would say it's fascinating, because each of those different places, for example, the recycling end, they're really, because that it's not a resource that's kind of fixed in space and time. It's a very, not that geological ones are when you're thinking about real geological time scales, but compared to, say, a battery that's going into an EV that's then going to recycling, that's a very quick system. So they're reliant on a very different set of ways of measurement and pulling in the uncertainties and probabilities and materials flow analysis of what some of these end of use waste streams, new product streams might look like. But that's a very different way of defining how much material metal will be in 10, 20 years' time. It's a very different process to how we classify up a resource in a mineral deposit at the moment, where the confidence is mostly done on how many drill holes you have and your understanding of the geology, which I think lends itself to the fact that there is probably learnings that everybody can take from each other, regardless of which part of the material system you're looking at. I really think it's a great opportunity for mineral resources to have a look at what's being done in oil and gas, have a look at what's being done in geothermal, and look at the kind of more probabilistic and scenarios based resource estimation that's done there. But I think vice versa, like, there is probably learnings from the mineral system that other people can take on when it comes to, recoveries. And yes, you might have this material stream, but how much are you effectively going to get out of it? How locked up it is? How does that go into the design process? And coming back to this kind of circularity idea, it's like, how do we make sure that things are easily recoverable at the end of life and these kind of things? So yeah, I think everybody needs to learn from each other, but they're very different approaches. So it's going to need a lot of, common language is needed, and that's quite hard.
Yeah, I think we keep talking about learning in all of this, and I think I just want to listen and thinking, people listening to this podcast who might be new to UNFC and have probably found out about it through something like the Critical Raw Materials Act, and it being enshrined in this pretty hefty piece of European legislation that have big, geopolitical intentions, ambitions, and repercussions. Yeah, I certainly, when I first was introduced to UNFC, thought, there's things in the CRMA. It's got to be pretty. Everyone must know what they're doing. it must be very ironclad. And I think that lots of people do know what they're doing because they're very experienced in it. This is something that they've worked on for their entire life. But this application to mineral systems is pretty new for the lifetime of UNFC, UNRMS, and what's been going on with other codes. So anybody listening, there's a lot of learning to be done. I think maybe sometimes people feel because of this reporting piece, it needs to be very ironclad and prescriptive. And I guess maybe be interested if this is your opinion as well, Eva. The flexibility that UNFC gives the user is perhaps really its aim in the CRMA, and to kind of think about its intentions and get to honest answers rather than kind of that's the box that fix it both, despite the box-based graphic that comes with UNFC. But yes, and that's kind of maybe why we're talking so much about these learnings and where there are opportunities to enhance as we go. But I don't know what you think on that side of things.
Yeah. Again, it's UNFC. It's been around for a while. Like it has been around, but it's really only been catalyzed recently into kind of being pushed up the agenda of people going, oh gosh, I actually need to know what this thing is and what it does. And that's quite scary from a mineral resource perspective, where we've been trained like for years in this is how you do it. This is the way we do it because we have to be so consistent. Otherwise, you get misinformation, and nobody wants that. But again, going back to the intentions, it has a slightly different intention for the Critical Raw Materials Act. It's really around security of supply. It's around understanding where are you? How quickly could you get into production? What are the challenges that you face in getting to production? So it's coming from a different place. It's not coming from this is a great investment aspect. It's coming from, okay, this is a project that has potential. How much potential does it have? And where are the barriers to it going forward? And are those something that can be overcome? Or is it one that actually, you know what, might be best to leave it on the shelf for now and come back to it at a later date, because trying to have so many projects going ahead at the same time does make it difficult. But again, there's so many things compounded in this with geopolitics, the race for securing supply of energy transition materials, the communities, how you have reindustrialization, mining in European countries, a change back to actually production systems where we're going to production from the resource in the ground that we've massively moved away from in our European context. There's so much conflated into this that it's a lot to pack in, and that's why it can seem a bit overwhelming. But the intention is there and the intention is good. It's just, trying to implement it. There will be some teething issues, and I think that's maybe what we've been seeing. But I think people just have to stick with it, and we'll learn from each other as we go forward and just try and make the improvements that are needed.
Thanks for that. And I think that is like a really good point, especially I think with the context of your work in Cornwall and the southwest of England. You're talking about that sort of historical a return to mining, a return to industry, and this sort of new green world we are moving towards. But a major point of, I guess, this podcast is to bring these a sort of variety of diverse voices together. Not only UNFC in this case, but also UNRMS. But it's really, how do you see the best ways of sort of actually getting all these people from different sort of areas, specialisms, industries? We're talking policymakers, the private sector, researchers. And not only just from, let's say, within Europe, but beyond, actually talking together how to responsibly manage resources going into the future.
Yeah. I would say that kind of the main place where this is discussed is at the Resource Management Week that's put on by the UNECE and the Sustainable Energy Group, which runs once a year and has delegates from a real range of places across the world. It's fantastic. And there's a great delegation from Africa and their codes with PARC and a few of the other things where they've really tried to design UNFC into the African mining vision there. But again, when you go to the ground in Africa, there still seems to be, depending on which country you're in, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, that may be known about, that might not be known about. Again, there's a really excellent group working in South America and Chile, again on UNRMS, UNFC. There are these hubs of information and people that are working on this, but it still hasn't quite cracked the boundaries, let's say, into the common industrial, I don't know, the common industrial knowledge base. I haven't seen it. It hasn't really been spoken about at things like Indaba or, I don't know, at PDAC or Resourcing Tomorrow. These are places where, given that you've got the industries, and this is again a very mining minerals focused aspect, but those are the places where the projects are being developed, who need to know about what this system is and therefore what it does, especially if they want to go for a strategic status, let's say, from the Critical Minerals Act. And I'm not sure that crossover has happened quite yet. I think people are trying to, and there's definitely been pushes, especially with the International Centres of Excellence, really trying to catalyse research in certain areas and elements of the UNFC and the UNRMS. But I think there's still a big information sharing piece to be done on bringing those stakeholders either into that discussion at Resource Management Week, or taking those people who go to Resource Management Week out into the very common industrial conferences, but also down to the regional, local scales, and these areas of concentration where we know these projects are going to be popping up. There are areas that will have projects, regardless of the type of project, in that critical mineral space, in other resources space. And it's almost taking the knowledge to them as well and having those discussions on the ground of, will this work for you? So yeah, it's being done for UNFC, UNRMS, still work to be done. We need a load more case studies and a load more people involved to really get that out there.
That's great. Could you, on that note, tell us a bit more about the International Centre of Excellence you're involved in?
Oh yeah, so I mean, tangentially, well, slightly involved in it. I'm not one of the main people in this. So yeah, so the UK has a International Centre of Excellence in sustainable resource management, but with a big focus on the circular economy aspects of the United Nations resource management system. So that's pulling together a group of universities and organizations who were previously involved in the UNICE program, so that circular economy research program that I mentioned earlier, of which Met for Tech was one of them. And it's bringing all of those people together to basically go, okay, we know we've got circular economy in the UNRMS. How do we do it? What are the next options? How do we do this from a recycling point of view? How do we do this from a steel production point of view, critical minerals point of view? And the idea there is really to consolidate what we know at the moment, where our knowledge gaps are, and identify areas for research and where the improvements needed. And the idea there is basically trying to get people together, trying to get projects up and running so we can really start testing the UNRMS and specific parts of the UNRMS in anger, let's say, to really stress test them going forward in the system.
So just on that, because you mentioned perhaps that kind of that lack of visibility at those big conferences, and you mentioned the kind of people who are involved in leading this charge. And I know you and I have talked a bit about this before in the past. There's this, some of those conferences are very industry focused, and opportunity for speakers can come with things like sponsorship packages of these events, and therefore, you know, there's essentially a cost associated with getting things visible, which isn't really necessarily how things like the UNECE or universities or UK Gov or whoever it is, these people who are involved in this really integral UNFC work can get things over the line. You kind of mentioned some industry associations in that. I'm not going to go and ask you, do you think there's anybody who'd be happy to help fly the flag? But Are there any ways that you think, or messages we need to try and get out more at these conferences, and maybe how we can all support doing that from what we can do at those events?
Yeah, I think I think as always, we need some champions in this space. And I know that, Stahl has been involved with this through the Vector project, and there are definitely that we are beginning to speak about it, absolutely. But I think we need to broaden the number of champions that we have if we're really going to have impact here. And as you said, like that cost barrier, the ability to actually go and speak, it's huge. Like we do not run on the same budgets at universities often, and yeah, governments, United Nations organizations, that this is not something that they can put money towards. It's just that's not how they work. Unfortunately, that's just it. So I think there needs to be a little bit of give and take, maybe, on what can be expected, and a bit of support of like, yes, we're trying to speak to you, but it's quite hard for. I feel like there's a barrier. Industry don't feel like they can necessarily go to the conferences that we go to when it's kind of in the United Nations, and vice versa. I'm not sure when we go to those conferences we feel like we can necessarily have a place to speak at the industry conferences on these subjects, which are quite thorny. Partly, I would say, because I think there's quite a lot of fatigue at the moment in the industrial sector on just how many standards are out there. And I know there have been some big consolidation exercises recently to try and help with that. But adding another one to the mix without the context of what it's trying to do, I feel like people go, oh my God, not another one.
Yeah.
Which
It's like, I mean, you're so right to raise it is in both directions, isn't it, as well? And I think sometimes we can, we get hung up looking at the direction that maybe we feel more, and it is both bi-directional in this case. And I suppose maybe from the direction that we experience more opportunities for lunch and learns, lots of a bit of R&D, getting centre stage, it's got to be amazing to talk about these things. Also, I suppose it shows the power of side events, and actually recognizing that if people can't come to the UNECE conferences, perhaps there are build-up days before that, and that's where EU Horizon projects can really have some opportunities for cross stakeholder engagement. I think that's a really interesting point. Thank you very much. I guess the big thing that we need to ask you about is naturally what were the outcomes of implementing a system like UNRMS?
when we applied it, it was super high level. We know about Cornwall quite well. We worked with the local enterprise partnership, Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. And basically the idea was it was looking at technology metals projects in the region, and fitting it into this system, trying to understand where they fit, and therefore by applying it, what needs to be done going forward to enable the whole region to have a sustainable resource management system in the context of critical minerals. So, a few caveats there. There are only a few of us working on it. It was only for minerals and metals projects. It did mention other adjacent opportunities, but the focus was primarily on those. So we didn't classify any other resources to UNFC that weren't minerals projects, or not critical minerals projects specifically, because that's what we were looking at. But it was still quite a useful exercise. We managed to come up with a series of recommendations on a matrix approach, so going across kind of some of those fundamental principles around the environment, economic, social, circular economy, and governance aspects, and then pulling those down into some of those facilitating principles of capacity and capability building, innovation, what needs to be done in that space. And that allowed us to basically come together with a series of recommendations of things that you could do, tangible things you could do to start to improve the system as a whole. So these were things like talent pipeline development, looking at, say, socioeconomic and environmental assessments, not on a project by project basis, but on a regional basis, so that you're comparing impact from across multiple projects, so you can highlight regional hotspots where challenges might occur, so that you can have multiple projects going into development in relatively swift succession. Other things in there were things like having certain equipment being in the county and available for use by local companies so that they can get faster results turnaround, and also have equipment that works well for the deposits that they have, because they're very specific deposit types. So we put all those recommendations down, and then we applied for more funding, because that's generally what we do. And we've had a lot of success. We've managed to get new equipment into the region. There's a new equipment hub that for people to access and use and look at the cutting edge of mineral processing. We've got our Critical Minerals Challenge Centre. That is something else that's come out of this, again applying the UNRMS framework to try and design like how should we go forward, what things do we need to consider. And so that's another aspect. We have the Georesources cluster project, which is around pulling companies together to have a regional cluster to share experience, share expertise, come together to try and get larger contracts. So all in all, what started off with just a basic application has actually fed into several £1 million worth of funding opportunities to really try and develop the region going forward, so it can have a sustainable resource management ecosystem. We're not there yet. There's still work to be done. There are still teething issues. There's still massive gaps, and the work will never stop, because it is an iterative process, but it is a start. And it was quite powerful in that aspect to, I don't know, tell people who aren't minerals people, like show them like, okay, this is minerals, yes. But this is all the stuff that you need to do around the side to actually enable these projects to develop in a way that you want them to develop. So it's not just the same old kind of project starts up, minerals get dug out of the ground, project gets closed, and we all go off again. Really trying to think for that long term, how do we have these sustainable regions going forward, so that when mining stops eventually, you can still have communities that are able to support themselves.
That is fantastic. Yeah. No, I think honestly, I'm not sure we could have got a better coverage of everything. Thank you, Eva. Yeah, and I think it's so important to like not only think. I think it's quite easy to sometimes only think of sort of just the environment sustainability, but looking forward into the future, making sure those sort of local people, local communities are engaged and have continued and flexible employment going forward is, I mean, we don't need a fly in, fly out system in the UK. I think we're a small enough country. So I think you've given some really great perspectives there.
I think that it was a wonderful way to flag the systems approach, the iterative approach, and as you just perfectly summed up, this is a process. It's about taking every stakeholder with you. This isn't just reporting to a single stakeholder like an investor through Crisco code. This is about a resource management system and a classification framework that is designed to take societal level kind of journeys with respect to the sustainability element, as well as the security of supply element all the way through. Fantastic. Thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you once again. It's been a great pleasure to have you on the podcast, and looking forward to see what you get up to in the future and giving us the lowdown on UNRMS as well as UNFC. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you, guys. I'm sure we'll be having many conversations in the future.
Thank you, Eva, for appearing. We really had a good look into sustainable resource management and the impact of not only UNFC, but at a high level UNRMS and how it can be supported and applied. Next episode, we'll be speaking to Rose Clark, who will give us her insights into the sustainability side of UNFC.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by guests or contributors on the podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, Satala and Critical Productions. Any statements made should not be interpreted as endorsements or official positions. Listener discretion is advised.